that this roundtable from Nairobi will be conducted in the form of a conversation, and this conversation will be moderated by Sam Okothopondo, and I will introduce Sam shortly. But first, let me introduce to the audience our four speakers from Nairobi. The very first one is Dr. Steve Auma, who is a legal anthropologist with a long-standing experience in advancing approaches to realizing social justice, legal rights, and human rights. He's worked with numerous civil society organizations, served on state-appointed task forces and United Nations programs, as well as on multiple academic committees over 25 years. His teaching, research, and publications on dialectical anthropology transverse the boundaries of various anthropological areas, such as the legal, the political, the urban, and the cultural. Steve's work on urban studies focuses on knowing, unknowing, and on circulating the various forms of urban subjectivities. Our second speaker is Wanjira Wanjiru, is a social justice advocate and human rights activist working in the Mathare area of Nairobi for a decade now, I understand, shedding light on extrajudicial executions and other grave social injustices. Wanjira is co-founder of the Mathare Social Justice Centre, which sparked the emergence of the social justice movement in Kenya, bringing together over 50, I believe, social justice centres nationwide. This movement organises the annual Saba Saba March for Our Lives, which saw Wanjira caught in a video that went viral as she resisted arrest, saying, quote, "When we lose our fear, they lose their power," unquote. Wanjira also writes for the Kenyan Organic Intellectual Network, which publishes on the experiences of grassroots activists providing historical context. A recent publication is Breaking the Silence on NGO Discourse. That's the title. Wanjira also coordinates the Matagari Kids Book Club, where children learn Pan-African history, and she's a co-host of Liberating Minds podcast on SoundCloud and YouTube. She also presents historical book reviews of texts such as The History of Resistance in Kenya. Wanjira also collaborates with the African Social Justice Network team in South Africa and Zambia. All of this, I believe, while pursuing a degree in international relations and diplomacy at the University of Nairobi. Our third Nairobi roundtablist is Diana Wachira. Diana is an urban and regional planner and expert with over 8 years' experience working in the fields of social planning, human rights, and gender mainstreaming. Diana is a practitioner of pro-poor, gender-responsive, human rights-based approaches to land and housing towards transformative urban planning. Diana is currently the Learning Officer at the Habitat International Coalition, where she hosts and promotes the development of members, the co-development, I should say, of members. She's an enthusiast of social planning and approaches that promote inclusive, sustainable urban communities. Diana won the first prize at the 2021 Land Portal Data Stories contest with an intervention that involved rapid mapping work to analyse the scope and magnitude of planned demolitions in Nairobi. And our final speaker, roundtablist, is Orlando Samuel Alco. Orlando is a trained urban sociologist with a master's degree from Maseno University and a bachelor's of law degree from the University of Nairobi. He served as a land and housing rights advocate for over a decade and is currently leading Pamoja Trust as the executive director. He's contributed to development policies and legislation on land, housing, climate change, access to justice, urbanization, community participation affecting the urban space, and the nexus between urban communities and rural communities. Orlando has also engaged with regional and international reporting mechanisms, championing the social justice cause. And our curator and moderator for this session is Sam Opondo, Associate Professor in Political Science and Africana Studies at Vassar College in New York State. Sam's work examines the mediation of estrangement, biopolitics, the ethics of aesthetics of cohabitation in colonial and post-colonial societies, and much more. His work also engages amateur diplomacies of everyday life and popular culture in urban Africa. Amongst Sam's many other works. He's the author of, I quote, Diplomatic Parasitations, Genre, Foreign Bodies, and the Ethics of Cohabitation, published in 2021. Sam, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introductions, Geoff. And I'd like to begin by thanking David for inviting us to the conference and for curating this space where we can speak about Nairobi's urban diplomacies. I'd like to thank Mildred for all the hard work that has gone into coordinating this and other panels, and very, very much thankful to the 4 panelists who have agreed to be part of this conversation. Finally, I want to thank the urban theorist Abdul Malik Simon, who helped us make some of the personal and conceptual connections that will be part of today's conversation. As illustrated in the United Nations Human Settlements Program, State of the World Cities, Bridging the Urban Divide report of 2010, the world is inexorably becoming urban. Obviously, the urbanization of the world is also transforming diplomacy while creating new forms of mediation, new types of estrangement and divisions. As a 2010 report goes on to state, inequality has become a dominant feature of urban life today, such that the urban divide between the haves and the have-nots opens up a gap, if not an occasion or a chasm, an open wound. And this is something that today's panelists are very attentive to. People who have been doing, I think, very important work in making these collaborations and coordinations and even resistance possible. To facilitate today's conversation, I will ask a few questions and invite our panelists to share some remarks and reflections rather than make presentations. This will allow us to go deeper into the work that each of them does, while at the same time raising critical questions about urban diplomacy, inequality, post-colonialism, NGOs, capitalism in Kenya's capital city, social justice, humanitarianism, maps and urban spatiality, and even the more than human beings that we must coexist with in Nairobi. The conversational format is intentional. It seeks to interrupt the quick and uncritical turn to reportage that Nairobi and other post-colonial cities saturated with non-governmental organizations, diplomatic missions, religious institutions have adopted as a primary mode of articulating and presenting diplomatic and political life. As we will see, the panelists' work and personal experiences and broad range of knowledge is attentive to how colonialism, class, diplomacy-induced urban planning, and corporate remaking of this self-help city has led to the proliferation of apparatuses of enclosure, erasure, consumption, and policing of public space that affects the city's rhythms and ethics of coexistence. This makes it possible for us to discern, as James Dadarian tells us, that diplomacy is always an ensemble of practices, power struggles, and truth contestation that develop into a dominant discourse of dealing with the other. This means that diplomacy must be studied alongside other social practices of everyday life, and its bearers cannot be abstracted from the site of emplacement, which for us today will be in Nairobi. And Nairobi is a key diplomatic site in the East African region, a place that is also drawn into a lot of global issues. As we know right now, for instance, Kenyan police the plans to send Kenyan police to Haiti, while the very panelists here are people who've been highlighting over a long time the work of the police in Nairobi and other parts. So we are able to see how studying a city like Nairobi gives us primary insights about global phenomenon, and it's not the only place where we can do this. I want to turn to a series of questions that will give us an insight into each of the panelists' trajectory, a glance over Nairobi's history and structural forces, the diplomatic maps and realities that they engage, and their visions and relations that they envision for this urban diplomacy. In terms of responses, we'll begin with Wanjira and then move over to Steve Accord, and then Diana and Orlando finally. So the first question to you, and you feel free to take it in the direction that best articulates your work. I'd like to learn a little bit more about how you came to do the work that you do, and how this has been inflected by the transformations in the city, and what are the principles, philosophies, or theories that inform your work, diplomatic or otherwise. So over to you, Wanjira.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sam, and also to the University of DePaul for having me. Such a privilege and honor. Now, to answer your question, I started doing this work right after my high school education, and it was informed by the normalization of police killings in my community. It was very normal to hear in the news 5 young men shot by the police. The next day we hear another 3 men shot by police. Another time we hear that. And I was like, why is this normal? Why is it okay to hear this every day and we're not doing anything about it? Also, my own brother was killed by police during the 2007-2008 post-election violence in Kenya. And so I joined other concerned citizens of Mathare, and we said, let us challenge this normalization of police excesses. And we started the Mathare Social Justice Center. The initial reason why we started was to just stop those normalization and start talking about it. And then with time, we got to see how it is tied to all these other things, to colonialism, to poverty, to lack of social justice in the community. And what is amazing is how kind of city diplomacy started taking place in the Nairobi city itself with the informal settlements, like city diplomacy within the city, if you get what I am saying. So us comrades in Mathare linked up with comrades in Dandora, which is another informal settlement, and Kibera, which is the biggest slum area in Kenya, and kind of our issues are interconnected and the same. We are all talking about police killings. We are all talking about lack of water in the community. We are all talking about bad healthcare. We are talking about lack of enough schools in the community. We are all talking about social injustice. And that became the basis of our organizing, that we have a social justice movement that speaks in unison about social justice, human rights, and the Utu philosophy, which is about you are because I am, respecting the human dignity, the person as a whole, and acknowledging the rights that they are born with on the basis of being a human being.
Thank you very much, Wanjira. Over to you, Akot, who's been doing this for a very long time. If you could speak a little bit about your trajectory.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sam, and thanks for inviting me, and also for really putting together what I think is a very rich panel. So I did not come to Nairobi. I was born in Nairobi. So I've been in Nairobi for more than 50 years, equivalent to, my age. And I was born in a slum called Korogocho in Eastlands, and I have therefore experienced what Nairobi has been. During those early days, slum, like Korogocho, was a place of the leftovers. In fact, the name Korogocho itself means leftovers. Wanjira can explain this more than I can because it is extracted from Kikuyu dialect. And while Mathare at that time was emerging as the Boston of the Mau Mau in those early years, there are no major settlements in Mathare in 1970s because the first Mathare was vanquished in 1950s during the emergency. And then there was mining going on in Mathare, which is where the building of the lower part of Nairobi got its resources, be it the building stones, built the sand. It all came from Mathare. That's why you have Mathare Valley as a major part. Kibra at that time was mainly a post-war settlement area, mainly by war veterans who had been recruited from South Sudan, or basically from the Nubian Mountains. Another parts of Nairobi have grown over time, again from the leftover perspective. If you look at places like High Ridge, Gorgon, these are places that grew when first the colonial government undertook evictions as a health and safety issue, because they argued that the poor people who lived in the servant quarters or in the margins of the industrial area were breeding pests, rodents, and cockroaches. So to clear the city of rodents and cockroaches and other pathogenic insects, they did demolition. And those people moved into Eastlands, and later on, of course, parts of rural areas, which were coffee growing areas, were inhabited by people who were of low income, and those also become what we now call informal settlements or slum areas, as others want to call them derogatively. So my engagement with the Nairobi and my urban work is basically a search for dignity, like Wanjira is saying. So in terms of scholarship then, my first major writing on Nairobi was when I was doing my undergraduate degree in the mid 1990s, where I was very intrigued by the anthropologists who were writing on low-income areas in Mexico, and particularly, those who are looking at the impact of women-headed households in the urban character of the time. Because you see the emergence of women as head of households in the urban areas in colonial cities like Kenya, and also colonial and slave cities like those we find in Mexico, was an antithesis, because there was initially restriction of movement and women were not supposed to be in the city. So in the 1990s, women were heading households in Korogocho. And so that intrigued me, and that was my first entry point into that conversation. Over the years, however, I have retained my conversation on Nairobi around the question of becoming. And I am interested not on what Nairobi is doing to people, but what people are doing to Nairobi, be it refugees from South Sudan, Somalia, Congo, Burundi, Uganda, or be it people who receive money from sources which we can't explain, especially when the arrival of that money corresponds with violence, like terrorism-related violence or piracy in neighboring countries. So on the one side, there is a ransom economy. On the other side of the border, and in Nairobi, there is the emergence of apartments and tenements. So I'm very interested to what people are doing to Nairobi with money, and the poor people, what they're doing to Nairobi as well, has been very interesting to me. And I'm inspired by our common friend. I am a good friend like yourself to Abdul Malik Simon, Edgar Peterson, and we have collectively been looking at this cityness as something that is not about structures, is about people. And my current reflections and writings, therefore, and I do a lot of that with Sam Orlando and Diana, with whom we've been colleagues for years, is on this notion of making Nairobi competitive. The competitiveness of Nairobi, in my view, is a new catalog of giving Nairobi identity and identifying those who are in Nairobi. And we see it with the upsurge of the role of UN Habitat, which is resident in Nairobi, as a diplomatic center. We see it with the upsurge of the transport economy, be it to South Sudan to Burundi to Rwanda, and the competition between Nairobi and Dar es Salaam for that transport economy. But what it raises, therefore, in terms of my own anthropological lenses, is the social questions that come to the table. And I'm very interested with the works of people like Anthony Giddens, who are interested in, okay, so how is the citizen developing identity in this environment that supposes certain hegemonic tendencies? Like Nairobi now, everything's about big construction, big roads, big highways, big railway. So my question is, so what is a big railway doing to citizenship? And what is citizenship doing to big railway? So I'm very interested in the concept that develops from Giddens, and Giddens, I think, paid attention to Foucault. And recently we have people like Peterson and Malik, and I think there's another colleague now in South Africa, Cape Town, called Lemek, who have coined the term infrastructure citizenship. So my engagement with diplomacy and how Nairobi performs itself there is to look at this concept of infrastructure citizenship, where I am interested in seeing how do people see this superhighway, and how does the superhighway see them, and how does that produce the Nairobian, and how does that Nairobian therefore represent Nairobi vis-a-vis the SGR, vis-a-vis the new airport, vis-a-vis the bypass, vis-a-vis the new highway, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and thanks for bringing up the question of people as infrastructure in Nairobi, or infrastructure that is a lot of it Chinese built. Yeah, so to be able to see the multiple connections, when you see the highway going up, oftentimes it's also the flattening of a lot of the settlements, the work that Orlando and others are doing. Diana, if you could speak a little bit about your trajectory, the work that you're doing, your attentiveness to maps and stories, will be interesting to hear how that intersects. So over to you, Diana.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam, for the question, and of course for this discussion. Well, as I was introduced, my background is in urban and regional planning. And I must say, reflecting back on those many years ago, my perspective on urban planning really did not include the informal. I think it was also because of the, I'd say, the approaches to the education. We thought about planning, particularly planning in regards to, planning an open field, planning an open space. At that point, we didn't have to think about, what about planning where there's people, where there's development, where there's these complexities of informality. So when I finished school and got immersed into this world or this universe of informal urbanism, I think that's the point where my professional life and my career started getting shaped. And I'm happy to be on this panel with Dr. Steve and Sam, who have been key in this trajectory of mine. I'd want to particularly highlight that my understanding and my practice of planning through engagement with informal urban communities has shifted to include social planning, adaptive approaches, human rights-based approaches, feminist approaches, as well as democratic and participatory decision-making and management. This has been or have been the components that have shaped my participation and my engagement, particularly to understand that when we're talking about planning, we need to ask the question, who represents the city? Who are these plans for? Where are these voices of the city? Looking at spatial patterns, because Nairobi has a range of spatial patterns that are determined by inequalities. So you'd find quite lines. I mean, there are lines of inequality separating the have and the have-nots. Therefore, my profession particularly has been anchored around rethinking the city for social transformation, whereby when we talk about urbanism, we're looking at it as a factor that is not neutral. Cities are shaped by values of the society. So, for example, my conversations and my work in feminist urbanism has been based on the understanding that you'd find in Nairobi and in informal settlements and informal communities across the country, that societies are shaped by very patriarchal values. So when it comes to land and housing, when it comes to access to capital, amongst other ways of citizenship, we find that that is a factor that we need to take into consideration. There's also the various or the diverse perceptions, needs and aspirations, as well as the fact that the city produces overlapping discrimination and oppression. So there are along lines of gender, along lines of age, of income, of class as well. And I think that is something that we will reflect on later. On issues of migrant status, I think we have done also quite a lot on having inclusion when we're talking about migrants. But there's also the aspects of the different uses of time and space in cities. So when some part of the city goes to sleep at night, there's a bigger part of the city that is vibrant, that is working, that is in different income generating activities, but then also the kind of multiple skills in the city. So we are looking at the body, the home, the neighborhood, the city, and the country at large. So these various principles of rethinking the city have been key in shaping my trajectory, have been key in the work that I do. And in particular to the mapping, I think mapping in this work has come out as one of the key methodologies and tools that we are using to visibilize the informal communities. As I said in the beginning, in studies, in school, we never really saw beyond the blocks that were highlighted as informal settlements. So you'd find, for example, an upper scale community, is mapped, has all these lines showing water reticulation, sewerage lines, for example. But when you come to the map of the informal communities, there is really nothing. It's just basically a big circle. So our work the work that I've done over the years has been more about bringing visibility to these blocks, that there are people that are there, that these people have certain values, that they have certain principles, and that there are ways that they survive and they live in the city, and that there are ways that every single day, they contribute in a big way to the city through human capital, through these values and what have you. So in retrospect, and as I conclude, I think the kind of work that I have done has been really guided towards rethinking the city, giving the voice to what have been termed over the years as voiceless, despite the voice that they have and the work and the resource they give back to the city, and also around saying the people who represent the city, or what represents the city, are these communities themselves, and they have the right knowledge, they have the right tools, and they have the right capabilities of participating just like everyone else. So with that summary, I think I give it back to you, Sam.
Okay, thank you. We'll hand it over to the other Sam. Yeah, Orlando. Yeah, if you'll speak a little bit and just let us know what your trajectory is, the work you're doing with Pamoja, and as also connecting it to what the other panelists have been talking about. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Sam. And I'm glad I'm taking this call from the western part of Kenya, where I come from. And it's an area that really shaped my activism as a student activist in 2009, when I joined other colleagues who mentored me over time. And some of the principles that have guided my perspectives include the rule of law, democracy, participation of the people, human dignity, social justice, inclusivity, equality, non-discrimination, and protection of the marginalized. And I say so because it's said that any society that wants to flourish, they normally take care of its most vulnerable populations. And when you look at our cities today, you find that majority of the urban residents actually people who come from the low-income areas. But there's a paradox, is that it is the low-income areas that have got a lot of votes, and that's where the politicians, as the ambassadors, first run to when they're campaigning. But it's the areas that lack basic services, despite their richness. And this then brought forth the question on the crisis of the representative democracy. And the representative democracy, having members of parliament as diplomats, and the questions that as diplomats who make laws and regulations, then whose interest are they furthering within the parliament or within the houses that make laws? And then this again brought another debate on the crisis of multilateralism, that to what extent do the houses of representative democracy further the interest of the urban citizens, or are they the diplomats of the states that have got interest within the economy that trade with our nations? But then as this then continues, then the debate sets in, and the debate is between those who come from the margins, organizing within the lines of friendship, within the lines of residents associations, within the lines of community-based organizations and social movements, and trying to challenge and provide an alternative voice. And I may call a diplomatic voice, and that's where I come from, because as an activist, then I serve as a diplomat. So then to what extent do then I have the opportunity to question the space of representative democracy through using evidence? And what is evidence? Is evidence on the basis of what is generated through scientific rigor, or is evidence on the basis of the everyday lives of the urban residents who come from the margins? And this is in the context of their innovations to challenge the problems that they go through. And this may include innovation around access to water, innovation around access to electricity, innovation around security of tenure and to challenge forced evictions, innovation on access to livelihoods. And one of the things that is glaring is the extent to which the representative democracy do not appreciate the innovations of those who are in the margins. So then that as diplomats, then representative democracy is failing to give that voice. Then to take it further is that basic services, which normally to a large extent indignifies, is treated as a token during elections. And in most occasions, it's a promise that we will bring water, we will bring health, we will bring livelihood, we will support you to achieve this. And it's on the basis of a token that happens after every 5-year cycle. So to what extent as an activist then, and as a diplomat, then do I go back to the community and organize through making the innovations be a basis upon which they access basic services? Then lastly, as I conclude, is that ultimately this links to public finance management. And this is where the crisis of multilateralism kicks in. Questions around public debt, the questions around the space of our bilateral partners and their investments in the economy. And to what extent do this lead to the commercialization of basic services that then continues to push those who are already vulnerable to more vulnerable populations? And as an activist and as a diplomat, then how do I shift that conversation to bring dignity, to bring voice, to bring space to this population? So that's how I will describe myself, Sam, and I hope it's adequate. Thank you.
No, thank you. There's a theme that's emerging, and maybe we will respond to this in the next question. But for those who do not have, let's say, the Kenyan or Nairobian context, and thank you, Ajira, for sharing earlier on, for instance, the 2007-2008 post-election violence. As people will note, for instance, with Kenya, you cannot have democracy without diplomacy. People go to the elections, and then after the elections, you have to have negotiated settlements, handshakes, government of national unity. The Kenyan model being something that is exported to places like Zimbabwe. When Mugabe would win, as incumbent, but we know that Changarai had won and has to include the other. And those who are at the margins, bear the brunt. The communities become fractured along ethnic lines, along other class lines. And this is something that now brings us to the next question, which is about Nairobi as a city of deep divisions. It's not a city, for those who are in yesterday's conference, like Nicosia, where you would be talking about the north and the south with the buffer zones, or it's not a walled city. It's not a place where you have separation walls, but it is a city that has deep divisions along class lines, which is in itself an inheritance of the colonial racial spatial order. Maybe this will be a good opportunity for you, each of you, to speak about your efforts to build bridges, challenge these structures of exclusion, promote dignity and cooperation and collaboration among those living in various parts of Nairobi. Over to you, Wanjira.
Sorry, Sam. Can you come again on that question, please?
If you could speak a little bit about the work that you're doing to build bridges or challenge structures of exclusion or promote dignity and cooperation in various parts of Nairobi, either as yourself or as part of NSJC.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. The work that we are doing to try and bridge the bridges is, I think, we're trying to have our own kind of things going, things like alternative education, even with community libraries that are now coming up in the different parts that have the kind of education that is real. Because, you know, also we realize, especially history, the kind of history that is taught in schools is incorrect or very shallow. So we are starting these community libraries with books like for Franz Fanon, Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah on Pan-Africanism, Julius Nyerere, all these great Pan-Africanists, and having people learn about them. The other thing we are doing is reaching out to our comrades in Muthaiga. For example, Yash Falgai and Jill Guy, who's across the road on the other side of the leafy suburbs. We have made them our friends and our comrades, and they are happy to engage and see how they could also help bridge the gap with the poor. For example, paying school fees for the children in Mathare and giving us legal support when we need, because as a community organization, we also take on a lot of cases that we shall need lawyers for. We are not in a position where we can hire lawyers, so we are able to rely on Katiba Institute and Yash and Jill Falgai to help us maneuver the legal part of it. But most importantly, I think creating a community for ourselves is really important. A community for the oppressed, if I might call it so, because there we find family, we find comradeship, we find solace, and striving towards the same things is what I would say unite us. And having events that we can have these conversations, book launches in particular, and also important events like the Pan-African Women's Day, Pan-African Day. And now that one, there's no exclusion. Everybody is invited to the event. And that is where we are talking about bridging the gap. We're talking about the haves and have. We're talking about the roles of the middle class, because we in the grassroots, we need a lot of support. We need a lot of support from the Kenyans who are able to give us that support. Yeah, I think those are some of the ways that we are trying to bridge the gap, the gaps, and sharpening our ideological clarity, which is the intensity of the work. The ideology has to be very clear for all of us. So the road is clear. We are all moving towards this direction. So I think that is the ways in which we are bridging the gap and openly calling out for solidarity. Even there's an event we are having tomorrow, and we put out a poster asking for Kenyans to stand in solidarity with us, to enable us to buy food for the event, to award some of the shujas. Shujas are heroes that are in Mathare, because Mathare being
Sorry, you've frozen. Wanjira?
To celebrate tomorrow. And Kenyans have supported. We have managed to raise 50,000 from the public. So I think there's also a growing consciousness of the importance of standing with the grassroots and working with them this journey.
Wanjira, maybe before moving over to Dr. Koth, just to bring people up to speed on the social justice center model, how this differentiates or challenges the NGO model that has been the dominant one. It will be important, and the kinds of networks, both in the city and beyond.
That's amazing. That's a great question, Sam. How the social justice centers challenge the NGO model of organizing is we are based in the community itself. We are members of the community that are actually talking about these issues that are affecting us and working towards changing them. So that having projects, and after the project is over, the issue of water is still a problem in that community, or a project on gender-based violence. After the 1-year project, GBV is still a problem. So not addressing the root causes. As we are trying to understand the root cause of why is it that in our community there's no water, and just across the road, water is overflowing. How do we address this problem once and for all? I think that's the fundamental difference between us and the NGOs and the kind of networks we have been able to make. It's interesting that just as we started to unite down here as little grassroots, we are also uniting now on the continental level with the oppressed people of Tanzania, oppressed people of Zambia, oppressed people of South Africa, and we're trying to build the African social justice network that will guarantee that all Africans have a birthright of social justice, no matter where they are from.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Koth, if you will speak a little bit about these deep divisions and the nature of your efforts to build bridges and challenge the structures of exclusion that you began giving us a very good history on.
Thank you very much. And I align a lot also with the comments from my colleagues, but let me just add that, so I must say, to use the word of Wanjira, I'm a bit privileged that I can be able to engage, and I do engage these questions from multiple platforms. First as an academic, and I have picked up the question of the so-called slum upgrading. And we asked the question, who needs upgrading? If you hear, for example, the dialectics that were raised by Wanjira between Madare and Mutaiga. So figuratively, in Nairobi, when you hear is a city of divisions, is that every affluent area has got an adjustment or adjacent low-income area, which feeds it in terms of labor, in terms of artisan maintenance work, in terms of food, because they also are able to bring in food that is cheaper than what you get into the market, but also in terms of them remaining worse off for the high income areas to continuously become better off. For example, the high income areas use lots of water than Nairobi city can provide. So what happens? So the low income areas have less water than they need, so that the high income areas have got water for themselves, their pets, washing their cars, washing their carpets. So this is it. So it's a very structural design, and as Sam rightly said, it is a design that builds from the colonial history of Nairobi. So the big question we have for Nairobi is really to try and rupture it off from its colonial blueprint, because the colonial blueprint is intact, and this is the same problem we have in Cape Town. The functional racist cities that were designed for to offer particular spatial and functional operations that were racialized is a big problem. and it requires much more than Nairobi is doing to deal with them. So the question of who needs upgrading is very important, because as Diana said, if you go to many low-income areas like Madare or Kibra, you realize that the low-income residents of the city are not just sitting and waiting. They are designing mechanisms of getting water. They're designing mechanisms of getting a pathway, and the pathway has multiple functionalities. And Diana said those functionalities vary in time and space. Now, when the World Bank and the UN Habitat comes to do upgrading, they say, no, you can't have a road here. No, the road can't be this size. No, you can't have commercial functions in residential functions. They must be separate. So my work has been about saying that imposing an idea of modernity in the name of upgrading, which is in the lineage of the very logic that creates divisions and marginalizes the majority, cannot be the future of Nairobi. So we have to ask the questions, who needs upgrading? Which is a question that would suggest that those who are well off must accept that those who are worse off becomes better off before they improve to another level. So this is a justice question. And we think that slum upgrading, the way it's being done now, is not paying attention to that. The second thing, which is more practical, how I do it, is on the justice question. I'm a justice worker. My vocation is justice. And recently, Sam Orlando was invited by the Kenya Highways Authority to mediate in a case where we have occupiers in good faith who are being asked to give way for a highway to be constructed. And this highway is basically one that links Mombasa to Nairobi. And then the design of financing at the moment, be it from African Development Bank, from the World Bank, or European Development Bank, is that all of them have got a grievance redress mechanism. The residents who are occupiers in good faith and are protected under the Constitution of Kenya have attempted to deploy these international tools of justice, which are part of the financing arrangement, to safeguard their rights and expand their claim to the cities. The problem is they don't have the language. They know the discourse, they know the instrument, but the language is framed in a legalese way, or is framed within an idea of rights that is captured in the neoliberal discourse, which does not deal with these questions of inequality. So what we've done, and we did this work with Sam Orlando, is to be part of the panel of mediators. And by being mediators, we were able to frame the question of justice from the standpoint of whose justice. Because when you deal with justice from the neoliberal legal theorists, as framed by the likes of Jean, Raoul, then justice is seen within the framework of the contractual relationship between the people and the state. And the people are supposed to just wait for the state to be the sole dispenser of justice. But we argue that that is not accurate. That is not accurate. The contractual model of justice cannot work, in our view, to respond to the justice questions in the context like Nairobi. It requires a negotiated framing that deploys international discourses like the ones used in the World Bank, social safeguards mechanisms, the ones used by the African Development Bank grievance redress mechanisms, with the experiences of inequality, so that whose justice becomes, you cannot remove somebody from a road reserve without telling them where they will go. Whose justice becomes, you cannot make the road too wide and then you demolish houses, while what you need is just a less size, but it's wide because you're using international standards. So we're saying, don't use international standards. Start from international standards, but finish with the land use functions as they exist here. So that's the practical part of it that I've been engaged in. I find it quite exciting. There are a couple of pieces will be coming out, writings will be coming out of this, including one of the roads now between connecting Nakuru, which is on the Rift Valley side of Nairobi, and the airport. It's a big highway. And what we see there is people are saying, we are not enemies to the road. So don't evict us so that the road comes. So don't tell us that you want us to relocate. Let us get a way of coexisting with the road. This is a new justice question, which is really also about rupturing the colonial functional construct and engaging from the standpoint of whose justice and who needs upgrading. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's interesting when you say upgrading, it's always thinking of the poor as those to be upgraded, yeah, rather than a moral upgrading, if you like, that is central, that goes to the core of what it means to decolonize and opening up other ways of relating and coexisting. Diana, if you could speak briefly, and I'll just repeat the question so that it's at the top of your mind. It's about talking about the work or your efforts to build bridges, challenge structures of exclusion, promote dignity and cooperation among those living in various parts of Nairobi, which is in itself a divided city, even if those divisions are not always apparent.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. I think in reflection to the question on the nature of efforts, I'd like to highlight it in 3 strands. So there's one on solidarity and building together in regards to coalition building. There's a second one on collective learning, particularly where we think about everyone's knowledge counts. And then there's also on advocacy and policy. Now, these 3 strands basically influence or highlight to the need to decolonize the contemporary ways of how we think about cities, how we plan for cities, how we act upon cities. I especially just want to also borrow from Steve's thinking, particularly around when we talk about challenging structures of exclusion. We're challenging structures of doing and acting around the city. So that's in regards to models of inclusion, particularly when it comes to talking about land, when we talk about housing, that is in the case of social production of housing and cooperatives, when we talk about participation as well, challenging models of participation and democracy, because when we say that, we have citizens participating, contributing to the city, building to the city, what exactly would that mean? What would that entail? And to what level of strategic participation and meaningful participation is this? So in regards to thinking about the nature of efforts, I wanted to highlight particularly one of the models that has been quite prominent in the work that we have done with Steve and with Sam, and that's on an integrated model of urban planning, an adaptive model of planning, where we're saying that we want to stop, this perpetuation of inequalities. It's about how to have planning that results in just and equitable cities. Planning that has an agenda focused on reducing inequalities, reducing exclusions, that is focused on this kind of, social, spatial, and most of all, political components, where we want to, or we think about strengthening the voice of communities within this political processes, where they determine how the city can look like or what the city needs in regards to how they use the city. And of course, really emphasizing, in regards to this kind of nature, is also really emphasizing the importance of, the local sphere, if I may say so, the community sphere, as a ground of partnerships between local communities and civil society, local communities and local governments, because local governments are closest to these communities. Looking at exploring alternative forms of these models I talked about, or exploring these alternative models of housing, of land ownership, of participation in the city, but then again also allowing for, advancement of social spatial justice and deepening of democracy, as well as thinking about co-creation, thinking about these different tools of knowledge. I think knowledge and really how we are using it for transformative encounters in the city, to shape the discourses, to shape the actions, to shape the decisions, are some of the things that we really do take into account when we're talking about the city, and when we're talking about how to really transform and move beyond this kind of colonized contemporary way of thinking and doing. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Orlando.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think in dealing with the question is first to start by appreciating that the divisions are not only on the basis of class, but there are multiple layers of discrimination that is evidenced within the urban spaces in Kenya. And I can exhibit this by indicating the discrimination on the basis of security of tenure. Then there's another layer in terms of access to livelihood. Then there's another layer on the basis of gender, being a predominantly patriarchal society. And there's another layer based on ethnicity. Then there's a religious, orientation of a person being another layer. So that then the community that is engaging with the justice question, then it's a community that faces multiple forms of discrimination. And that the approaches to deal with this cannot be on the basis of one, it cannot be a single approach, but must take multiple forms of directions. And in appreciating that, it normally comes back to the definition of the state. When the state is normally defined, people seldom pay attention to the people. Actually, it's normally government. And in the government, we seldom try to unpack what representation entails, but go first to the constitution of the executive, where the presidency sits. And that then this forms then another class of players who are to a larger extent perpetuated, the divisions that we notice along class, because the political class then come together, shake hands, and we have a handshake, and when you have a handshake government, then it creates another community of players vis-a-vis another community who have historically faced multiple forms of discrimination. So that then the discrimination that people have on the basis of their ethnicity and class is then used for political purposes to advance political agendas. And you see this manifesting consequently in the institutional framework that we have in terms of dispute resolution, in terms of the bilateral agreements that the country and material agreements that the country is getting into, in terms of the representation that we see in the houses in parliament. And how this manifests, and Dr. Umar did highlight this earlier when he was speaking about development-induced displacement, is that when we negotiate, we normally negotiate on the basis of the laws of the country. But the laws of the country are made by an elite who do handshake, to protect particular interests. And the interests that are normally protected seldom reflect the interests that we speak about, the orientation that we have, or that form majority of the urban citizens. For instance, When we say that we want to apply the social safeguards as being applied by the World Bank or the European Investment Bank, it only happens when it is resources that are being advanced by these banks and they have to send their representatives to do monitoring. But if it is development programs that are fully funded by the government of Kenya, then these social safeguards do not apply. And we go back to saying that there is no keeper in good faith. We go back to saying that to get compensation, you must be having a certificate of title or a certificate of lease. So that ultimately, the people who come from the margin cannot say that they are apolitical. That the diplomats from the people's settlements must engage with these questions from a political perspective, which include representation. And that, what does representation entail? What does public participation entail? Does it detail the quality, or it's only on the basis of the quantity that you voted, you are represented? But on your representation, no one then asks a question, what is the quality of representation in diplomacy? So that then people can claw back and say that the delegated power that we did give in constituting the state is not being applied, because the kind of contracts the representatives are getting into to the institutional frameworks, the kind of conversations in furthering human dignity that they're getting to, does not reflect our needs as a people, but it reflects the interests of other states who are interested in the economy, investing in the economy, who are interested in perhaps power and how the power oscillates around the region, not only in Kenya. So that then ultimately, this power then can be shifted back to the people. So from my perspective, based on what my colleagues have spoken about, I'd like to then integrate this and the development of the city also within a political lens in terms of representation and what happens in lawmaking process, which in most occasions, as Karl Marx puts it, is by the owners of capital, the owners who do the handshake, the owners who further particular conversation within the political elite, and then this is coupled by other many layers, of discrimination that are then used as, an antidote to keep this particular population to the margins. Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you. In the interest of time, the next two questions will be open, such that anyone of you can respond. And there is a theme that is emerging in your responses, talking about development-induced displacement, for instance. But there's another level to it, which I think is diplomacy-induced displacement. And this is mainly because a city like Nairobi is a major diplomatic hub, a site of operation or coordination for governance, non-governmental organizations, humanitarian organizations working in East Africa and the Horn of Africa. The presence of these diplomatic missions and organizations has also contributed to the enclaving and fortifying of diplomatic zones. You go to Gigiri, Lavington, Muthaiga, as you pointed out, Wanjira, while abandoning the most populous neighborhoods like Mathare, or people not thinking of how does diplomacy look like in Eastleigh, a place that is not only engaged with Minnesota as a diaspora, but places like Mogadishu, or even the peace talks cannot take place without the involvement of such sites. These sites like Eastleigh, Mathare become targets for NGO projects, targets for demolition, or even security action. What, in your view, has been the impact of Nairobi's diplomatic zoning, unequal development, gated community development, NGO practices on those who are already marginalized by the state? If you could speak a little bit about your involvement in any projects, or just some thoughts that challenge or correct these separations by creating other connections. So Nairobi as a diplomatic place creates undiplomatic ways of inhabiting the city, or people get to overlook the many other diplomacies that are not recognized by the state, not recognized by international organizations. So just wanted to hear what your reflections are and the kind of work that you're doing to engage these realities. Anyone?
To my reflections, then my colleagues are
Yes.
better in terms of work, because I'm not. But so I really agree with that question. But as you've also said yourself, that so first Nairobi is a diplomatic hub, starting with the UN Habitat, and then all major embassies of Western capitals, at least have ensured they have got a presence in Nairobi. In fact, in the recent past, we've been competing with Pretoria, so that the UK, for example, wanted to have all their visas processed via Pretoria, but they couldn't undo Nairobi. However, the impact of Nairobi in diplomacy has shifted over time. During the days of President Daniel Arap Moi, the idea was the city should be clean, and when guests come, city should be you should get rid of any social life that are images of that, of dysfunctionality. So when the president was going somewhere, the potholes are carpeted, the commercial sex workers are removed from the streets, the people living in the streets are removed. The people who are jobless, cannot just go and sit in what we call jobless corners or the people's parks. That was the trend. In fact, every major event, and this is not just a Nairobi issue. When South Africa was hosting the World Cup, there's a big issue about keeping off the homeless and so on. We didn't see it as a big issue in Qatar. There are other issues, but so this is the trend. That was a trend at that time. At the moment, the pattern is different. Inequality in Nairobi has become a major diplomacy flavor. Slum tourism, as they call it, is a major element of diplomacy. So that the Prime Minister of France was in Kenya 3 weeks ago. Where did he go? He went to Kibra. Melinda and Bill Gates, when they come, where do they go? They go to Kibra. Even Kelly, when he came, where did he go? He went to Kibra. So slum tourism, showing off the inequality as an indication of underdevelopment or undevelopment, so as to develop a framework for collaboration based on helping you to advance your lot, is become a fashionable trend, not just in Kenya. It's a big issue also in Cape Town. It's a big issue in Johannesburg, and I know it's a big issue also in part of Lagos. So that slum tourism, of course, me and you know that slum as a name is a derogative name, but it is framed as such. Oh. Then there is a role of UN Habitat. The UN Habitat, and that's my last comment on this, the UN Habitat wants to say, we belong here, we will show good examples. So UN Habitat has been the engine of this dysfunctional, incompletely theorized, I would dare say, captured idea of slum upgrading. That idea has come from the UN Habitat. And it's an idea which is meant, as some said, not to cause structural changes, but to perpetuate the same inequalities. But allow me to make one final comment. The diplomatic nature of Nairobi is not just diplomacy in terms of high-level state relations. Nairobi has become a safe space for many people displaced who come as refugees, and you have the category called urban refugees. And urban refugees are huge diplomats in representing their cities and in producing images of Nairobi. For example, Eastleigh, which you have mentioned. Eastleigh was initially a satellite of Dadaab refugee camp. Then it became a satellite of several places in Minnesota. For information, I finished my PhD at the University of Minnesota, and whenever I wanted Kenyan food, be it Royco mchuzi mix, sukuma wiki, unga,
Mhm.
I would get it from a Somali Alliance shop. But
Yeah.
Isili has also helped us to see how do you.
Sorry, you're frozen. Oh, the cut is frozen.
Can I go before he
Yes,
unfrozen?
yes. Yeah, you can.
The impact of the diplomatic zoning of Nairobi is that the inequalities have been entrenched even more. And the other thing is, now that the class divisions are clear, we know where the rich class reside, we know where the poor class reside. There is criminalization of poverty, blatant, outright criminalization of the poor. The way people are treated in the upper is very different from the way the people in the have-nots are treated. And I agree with the speaker before me on saying that things like the UN Habitat are just entrenching the inequalities that are there. And this is why even movements like the social justice movements come up. It's because they're saying, hey, we are people too. We exist and we have this right. And we always say that this quote by Cabral, that we should always remember that people are not fighting for the ideas in anyone's heads. It's not about who's the smartest. We are fighting to change our material conditions. It's about our lived realities. And I feel like the world has been there for so long, the UN, all these bodies and entities that are supposed to be fighting poverty, fighting injustice, and all this, but it's still reading very nice on paper. In applied realities, it is a very different reality. As a young person, I acknowledge that Nairobi is a safe city for very many people. In Mathare, for example, we have a Kampala area. Kampala is the capital city of Uganda. So this is the area where it's just Ugandans that are there and thriving, doing business, intermarrying even with the people in Mathare. We have an area called Nigeria. There are very many Nigerians as well, South Sudanese. It's been a real city diplomacy. But it would even be better if we would not be fighting about things like human rights, decent housing, things like slums should not exist. It should not be a reality that we are fighting with all this money that is sent into eradication of poverty and hunger, even Shukana, as we talk about city diplomacy. We should really be at a point where we have been able to borrow ideas from elsewhere on how to deal with hunger, which is really just agriculture, applying city diplomacy in areas where it has worked best and it has been applied to eradicate hunger in that area and apply it here. Because at the end of the day, all we want is social justice for all and human dignity for all and human respect for everybody. Yes. In the interest of time, I am going to give back the mic to you, Sam.
All right. No, thanks. Just to wrap up, we'll have Diana and Orlando to share their thoughts on this. They work in this area, but also a few remarks for people to speak about their visions, about all these alternatives and how to be able to create or promote better relations between Nairobi and other parts of Africa and other parts of the world. We'll come back to you, Anjira, after we hear from Diana and Orlando. Over to you.
Oh, not a problem. Seemingly Diana is switching that I go fast.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
So I think before I go to the vision, is that it's emerging that other than the interests of the various parties that are represented in Nairobi, it's emerging that it's also diplomacy within the context of trade and economics.
Mm-hmm.
That I don't know whether I was frozen for a moment.
Yeah, for one second. Yeah.
That trade and development okay, not a problem. Yeah, so that trade and development is emerging to be a negotiated space, so that then the informal settlements are not seen as contributors to the development of the city, but are seen as trade partners, which to a larger extent is so exploitative. And this is how it manifests. That through representation in the parliament, you make a law to advance access to affordable housing. Then, as a diplomat, then you get resources by negotiating from World Bank to put resources in the housing fund. That when you put resources to those who are in the margins to buy, houses from a state-sanctioned, bilateral engagement.
Oh, yeah. Orlando is also frozen.
So that then you start commercializing the basic things that they know whether, I don't know, is better. Is it better now? But perhaps I give you Diana as I sort out my internet.
Okay, yes, you're freezing mid-sentence. So maybe Diana, and then we'll try and wrap up. Yeah, Diana, some remarks.
Thank you. I think it has been quite a fruitful discussion. Particularly, we've been really kind of mapping out some of the key elements and relating this to the realities that are there. I think as we conclude and as we think ahead, what I'd like to say is that the concept and the practice of urban governance, the way we approach it, the way we think about it, the way it's practiced, particularly in the context of Nairobi, needs to shift from thinking about how many people participated. When you have this validation forums with governments, that is normally a very big part that is emphasized, how many people participated. But I think we really need to talk about in terms of who was participating, where, when you talk about planning, putting together the vision for the city, we need to talk about who was there, who has the seat at the table, who's able to negotiate, who is able to represent, because as I mentioned, as we began, there are different and there are diverse needs, there are different aspirations, there are different demands for the city. So when we're talking about urban governance, we need to put into consideration the aspect of who, and for what purpose, because we're also thinking about collective or for the common good. So that has to be an integral aspect, as well as I think it's imperative that we have a sound political agenda, particularly for bringing on board these locally grounded strategies and partnerships, and linking that with local government work, as well as national government at another level, and of course, globally, because that is the only way we are able to achieve some of these commitments like the New Urban Agenda, the SDGs, among others. So well-defined, sound political agenda has to be key, and it has to be institutionalized to bring all these different actors together for the good of the city. So because of time, I'll stop at that and give it back to you.
Yeah. I had a few more questions, but we'll address them in responding to questions from the people in the audience. The first is both a remark from Noe Konago, who is a diplomatic theorist, does a lot on plural diplomacy and transprofessional diplomacy. And this is what Konago says. Congratulations for a wonderful panel. You're doing a great work in Nairobi, contributing to bring support, education, help, and advice to many communities, creating also the basis for the mutual engagement amongst them beyond social, cultural, economic, and political divides. This is something that established and mainstream NGOs rarely do, as they're usually placed in a very competitive context in which not only public and private resources, but even to gain access to the communities that they seek to work with, which is what Dr. Koth was pointing out earlier on with the slum tourism, are contemplated under corporate or managerial prism. In this context, I think that one of the most critical aspects of your work will be to remain as you are, to avoid the inertia, and let's say to avoid the organizational trap. Yeah, I would appreciate very much your thoughts on that. So avoiding co-optation. So keep your thoughts on this. How do you avoid co-optation? And then the next is both a remark and a question from Yolanda Spies. And this is what it says. The developmental identity of a particular city must be projected as part of the diplomatic narrative, even beyond Africa. Host cities have tried to hide their own flaws, but the latter are our global reality. African cities, like others in the developing world, are a microcosm of global inequalities. This is very much in line with Dr. Kotz's remarks that were cut off when you're talking about slum tourism, the cleaning, and just maybe you could complete that line of thought, and then we'll make a few concluding remarks.
Thank you, and I'm really sorry that yeah, I went out of bundles. That's what happened.
It's the infrastructure.
Yes, the infrastructure.
Yeah.
No, thank you. And yes, I really agree with the observation that developmental choices and international relations are sort of commingled and conjoined. I want to make 3 points as I conclude. One, when President Kenyatta was unveiling the SGR, Standard Gauge Railway, he said that I'm happy to unveil this railway. I'm not quoting verbatim, but this is what he said. I'm happy to unveil this railway built with our partners from China. This railway is different from the first railway that was built by the colonization, whose aim was to exploit. But the truth is that SGR exploits in more real time, exploit more brutally. You know, of course, colonization was an extreme of it, but in terms of, you know, there's normally what I talk about the rented house and the mortgage house. So the colonialists rented the country. So they were here, they were taking rent. But the Chinese have mortgaged the country. So it's more painful because you think it's yours, but you're paying mortgage at a very high rate. So while Kenyatta was saying that to really affirm that the relation between development and diplomacy, of course, he knew also that he wasn't very accurate. And that's a major problem. How do you avoid co-optation? It's very difficult. I also serve in the board of Pamoja Trust, and I serve in boards of 4 other organizations. But one of the biggest problems of non-governmental organizations is financial autonomy. They can say they are non-everything, non-political, non-governmental, non-God, because they say they're secular, and so on. But so long as they don't have financial autonomy, there's a problem. And yesterday, I learned a great thing from the panel. There's somebody from France who ran a conversation center. And she said, this conversation center has a model of raising money and using the money to do social justice work. She also said that they have a concept called the human library, So I think these 2 concepts for me are very useful, that NGOs who want to remain in allegiance with this work must first bank their work on the human library. Wanjira here is a great library. The activists, those who innovate, are a great library. And then second part is getting ways of getting money beyond the neoliberal sources. Let me give you a last case study as I go. One, we did upgrading of houses in Kibra. We is the government of Kenya. But immediately the planners left. When the architects left, when the designers left, the residents of Kibra started the upgrading. They modified the houses. They changed the kitchen to be a study room. They changed the store to be a toilet. They changed the lower, those were the multiple rooms. They changed the lower part to be shops. So epistemic change, like the kind we've seen in the works of Orlando, Diana, and Wanjira, is very important, because the problem that perpetuates these urban inequalities is the kind of planners we train, the kind of sociologists we train, the kind of economists we train for this epistemic project must go hand in hand with the activists, must go hand in hand with what the NGOs are doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll be closing in another couple of minutes, so maybe some last words from Diana, Orlando, or Wanjira. Any last words or reflections, most broadly? Yes, Wanjira.
I do have some last words that I'd like to say. I think in relation to the question you had asked, what opportunities do I see? I see the opportunity of the grassroots being included, like the decentralization of all these global processes into the grassroots. Because in all honesty, the people know what they want, the people know what they need, the people know what is lacking. And I do not understand why the people are not a great stakeholder and involved into these processes. It's a disservice and it's a wrong way to do things. So hopefully, as we sharpen and deepen city diplomacy, I'm hoping that within the city, there's going to be the diplomacies like the kind we're seeing here around the informal settlements, and exchange into another city, and then there can be diplomatic relations about how did you go about this, how can we go about this, because at the end of the day, we are moving towards progress. We are progressing as the human race. We are progressing as humanity. And the best thing we can do is learn from each other and involve the people, center the people at the center of every important discussion at the global level, be it climate change, be it eradication of poverty, be it better education, universal healthcare. Let the people decide, because the people know. Yes, those would be my parting shots. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Diana, Orlando, any last remarks?
So my last remarks will be on the basis of the paper that he shared with us on everyday diplomacy by Costas. And Paul's letter to the Corinthians. He asks a central question that I think is worth reflecting on as diplomats, that are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, like some people, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter written on our hearts, known and read by everyone. So that then the appreciation that sometimes the representation may not work, and that the definition of the people is that sometimes the diplomats themselves may not put your issues on the table, that they may be negotiating for their own particular interest, and that as it's been and Dr. Uma has put this, that we are mortgaged, and we are getting mortgaged. You are being mortgaged on the basis of commercialization of basic services.
Yes. Okay.
So then, what is the interpretation of the people? Who is people? That's a major question in the constituting of the state that we must come back to as activists and as non-governmental organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Diana?
Thank you. I think my concluding remarks would be just an emphasis that we need to adopt an agenda that is focused on reducing inequalities, an agenda that should strengthen democratic and participatory decision-making and management in the cities, and that should always, and of course, as I had said in my last remarks, strengthen and institutionalize this political aspect where we bring about grassroots communities, local governments, national governments, and the global community. I believe that is one of the key ways that we will be able to actualize these many global commitments that are there, and that will be able to change the realities of the communities that we work with.
All right, thank you. In that last minute before handing it over to Geoff Weissman to close, I would want to thank you all as panelists. You've exemplified some of the work that I've been doing on diplomacy, which has been to illustrate how a central thing in colonialism was to turn, let's say, African diplomats into non-diplomats, turning the diplomat into the native, non-recognition, conversion, rather than conversation, and to reclaim that space that, people who are thought of as incapable of diplomacy, incapable of thought, incapable of envisioning another future for humanity, showing that actually that displacement is not only physical, it's epistemological and even ontological, and to go to the core of challenging those things in everyday ways is a significant advancement, if you like, or upgrading of our thinking on diplomacy. Over to you, Geoff.
Thanks so much, Sam. Well, thank you, Diana. Thank you, Wanjira, Orlando, and Steve, for an absolutely enriching, stimulating, provocative, motivating panel. It has been fantastic. To you, Sam, for pulling this together in such a typically brilliant, intellectual, and politically stimulating way. So to all of you in Nairobi, we wish you the very best from here, and thank you very, very much for participating.